Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Bart, for the big intro. So, as Bart said, what I'm going to do next is talk you through some of the detail of the insights that we've picked up along the way of compiling our inaugural UK Top 50. First thing I should say is to qualify and be eligible to be part of the ranking, we're talking about brands of UK origin. So I think that's an important point to make. So before we dig into the insights, I'll talk a bit about the methodology behind BrandZ, and then we'll really get into some of the detail. So, I was thinking earlier in the week, what better way to start a presentation early in the morning and wake everyone up than with a relatively complex looking trend chart. But stick with me, because it's really not that complicated at all, and the insight is pretty dramatic. So, we've actually been doing our valuations at a global level on BrandZ since 2006. So we've got 12 years worth of valuations data. So on this slide, what we've done is plot the values over time, the average share price of brands featuring in 3 indices, the MSCI World Index, the S&P 500, and in blue, the average share price of the brands featuring in the BrandZ Top 100 Global list over that time period. And there's several things to notice on this slide. One is the BrandZ index clearly on average outperformed the other 2 and delivers fantastic returns for shareholders. So the insight there is building strong brands and investing in doing so delivers shareholder returns. So the BrandZ figure of 125% return over that 12-year period is actually 4 times as high as the MSCI index and 40% higher than S&P 500. So that's the first insight. Building strong brands delivers shareholder returns. But there's more with this relatively complex trend chart that keeps on giving. If you look at what happened during the financial crash back in 2007, 2008, all 3 of the indices dropped below into the red, if you like. But if you look at the speed of recovery of the 3 indices and the difference between them, so it took the brands within the S&P 500 and the MSCI index almost 4.5 years to recover back into the black. But if you look at the BrandZ index and the brands featuring in that list, it took them just 6 months. So not only does investing in brand deliver great returns, but also it protects your business and your profitability and revenues during times of economic hardship. So overall, that's why we at BrandZ, WPP, Kantar firmly believe that marketing should be viewed as an investment and not a cost for those reasons. So, a little bit on methodology. I'm not going to spend too long here, you'll be pleased to know. So, about how we value brands on BrandZ. So, there's 2 sides to the equation. So, the first one is financial value on the left-hand side. And that is based on numerous pieces of information, some of which is publicly available, and in theory, anybody could use. But the thing that sets BrandZ rankings and valuations apart is the piece in blue there, what we call brand contribution. That is a survey-based measure that essentially takes account of the view of the consumer. So we're doing thousands of interviews globally every year on BrandZ across numerous brands, numerous categories. So we've constantly got our finger on the pulse of whether consumer perceptions are improving or declining for brands, and we take that into account in our brand valuations. So by combining those 2 factors, financial value and the view of the consumer, most importantly, that is how we come up with our brand value. With everything else stripped away, that is the true value that is attributed to a brand. So that's how it works. And we feel obviously that second step is really important because ultimately it's consumers and businesses who are making those decisions around which brands to choose, which brands to buy. But we have 20 years worth of research data that sits behind those valuations. So using the size of the database, and again, what sets BrandZ apart is our ability to take those valuations numbers and really dig into, at a macro level, what makes brands primed to succeed and actually grow in value, but also to be able to zoom in to individual brands and understand, is their equity strengthening or weakening? What impact is that having on brand value? And clearly, the database is vast. So we've now got more than 3 million consumers, 120,000 plus brands across 400 plus categories, 50 markets. And this is growing all the time. We're adding new markets, adding new categories, adding new markets to our valuations work as well. Right. So clearly, this is our first year of conducting a UK Top 50, but as part of our global valuations work, over that 12-year period I talked about, happily we valued the top 10 most valuable UK brands over that period, so we can start to see how their values have actually shifted over time and what the implications of that are. So just to begin with, on this slide, we've got the top 10 most valuable global brands and how their values have actually shifted at an aggregate level over that 12-year period. And you can see it's been a period of real success for the most valuable brands. Their brand values have really grown quite dramatically, almost 250% of an increase since 2006 for our global top 10. If we then contrast that to the fortunes of the UK top 10 most valuable brands, we can see up to around 2010, 2011, the pace of growth of the UK top 10 was pretty much in line with the pace of growth of the global top 10. But since then, there's been a real tailing off and actually a slight dip in the last couple of years. So the UK top 10 in terms of value growth definitely has been lagging the global top 10. So we'll start to dig into some of the reasons behind that essentially. So, beginning with brand equity, and some of you may be familiar with BrandZ and Millward Brown's equity model. We talk about three key components to build a successful brand and to build strong equity. We talk about being meaningful, being different, and being salient. So just to take them one at a time briefly, meaningful essentially means a combination of being able to meet the consumer needs in the category and being able to build an emotional connection with the consumer. Difference is about being literally different and projecting leadership and setting trends within the category. And salience is about coming readily to mind when the consumer is making a purchase decision in that category, essentially. So given those are the three equity components, for the UK top 10, we can see over time, equity overall has weakened in all three of those areas. What's also interesting, however, is if you look at the lead measure of those three key ingredients, clearly it's salience. So salience is trending at a fair amount above both meaning and difference. So that's telling us that these brands tend to be known and very well known and more famous than they are different and they are meaningful. And that is actually unique for the UK top 10 versus the top 10s in some of our other markets. So you could read that and see it as a relatively exposed position because these brands are better known than they are seen to be different or connecting emotionally with the consumer. So perhaps ripe for disruption, definitely something to think about, definitely some food for thought. So the big question is, why are we seeing that brand equity weakening over time across all of those areas? And to draw on some global data to begin with, so this is from our global top 50, if we look at it to begin with. So innovation, we've seen, clearly adds value at a global level. So on this slide, we've got, on the left-hand side, brands within our global top 50 that are perceived to be the most innovative are clearly more valuable than those that are perceived to be the least innovative. And if we look at the relationship between perceived innovation and value growth over time, it's a really good one. So we know that innovation clearly adds value. However, if we look at the UK top 50 in aggregate versus the most valuable brands in other markets, and we look at our innovation measure in particular, 100 is an average score, by the way, we see that UK ranks bottom of the list against the global brands, but against all of those other markets. So it seems as though, for the top 50 at least, there does seem to be an innovation gap in the UK. Our UK top 50 are perceived to be less innovative than brands in other markets. So why is that? There's a couple of reasons that we think could be having an effect. So the first is that the UK top 50, on average, seems to be dominated by what we've termed heritage brands. So brands that were founded a longer time ago, essentially. We have some examples there. But if you look at the average age of the UK top 50 brands, it's actually coming in at 100 years old versus a global top 50 average of just 67 years. So UK brands are a third older than our global top 50. So this could be a contributory factor. We also look at technology and look at the types of category that our most valuable brands come from. So again, this is from our global list, and it looks at where those globally most valuable brands come from a category perspective. So you can see, and this has grown over time, almost half of those brands are now coming from the technology sector. Just 23% from telecoms, finance, utilities, and 30% from other categories. That figure is growing all the time. We expect it will grow again next year. So actually, the UK top 50, over 2/3 come from telecoms, finance, utilities, 31% other. So, I mean, we could argue slightly around whether some of those brands should be deemed technology brands, but the point is, using the same classification as global, it's actually 0. So certainly that could be another reason and another contributory factor why we have this seeming innovation gap. Age of brands, technology as well. And that's not to say that non-tech brands can't be innovative. We'll talk about some examples later of brands that are very innovative from non-tech, essentially. Okay, So meaningful difference, it's a term we throw around a lot on BrandZ and within Millward Brown as well. Essentially what it means is brand equity. So when you see meaningful difference, think brand equity. And that is really an outcome. And when we go and talk to clients about this, often the question is, okay, I need to be meaningfully different, but how can I do that? So we've used the size and scale of the BrandZ database I referenced earlier to break down 5 relatively intuitive areas, hopefully you agree, that actually all relate to brand equity, to give us another framework to think about and assess our brands against. So we call them the vital signs or the vital pillars of success. And you can see that obviously innovation is one of those, and I've talked about innovation already. If you think about the framework itself, though, it does fit together quite nicely. So if you have a brand and an idea in the first place, you need a purpose to actually exist and to take to market. You also need an innovation, a point of difference versus your competitors. If you have both of those things, you then need to amplify that with your communications to attract consumers in the first place. At that point, your consumers and users will then experience your brand. You need to deliver on the promises you've set up with your communications. If you get all of those things right, hopefully love and an emotional connection will be the result of that, essentially. It's an idea we'll come back to later on. But if we look at those 5 areas for the UK top 50 versus our global top 50, again, we can see the innovation gap, which I've talked about already. But there is a difference in all 5 areas. You can see the UK is slightly below the global top 50. The other 2 that are slightly bigger than the others are brand experience and brand love. And interestingly, they are 2 areas that can sustain a brand between innovations. So I think that fits together quite nicely. But we're certainly not saying that there are no innovative brands in the UK. There certainly are some very innovative brands in the UK. And here are some examples of those. So we have Dyson, Dulux, Sky, Virgin Media, ASOS and British Gas all do feature in our UK top 50. There are some others that are yet to successfully take their innovative power and scale globally, which is something we'll come back to. But certainly there are some innovative brands in the UK and some very innovative ones at that. What we can also do is actually look at each of those 5 areas and pull out some of the strongest performing brands in each area. So Body Shop scored really, really well on purpose. Innovation. Who was paying attention to one of my earlier slides? I've shown you this already. Who's had a coffee this morning? Most innovative? Dyson, well, yes, they're listening, excellent. Communications? Paddington Bear? M&S? Brand experience? Big corporation, begins with a B? British Airways? BBC? Good guess, though. And then brand love? Tesco. Was that a plant? So a few surprises. So we know, I don't think it was. Who shouted that? Actually, it was Darren, so maybe it was a plant. So we know that obviously Tesco have been through some tough times recently. They're certainly in recovery, but the strength of consumer affinity relative to their competitors is still there, and we certainly feel that that's helped sustain the brand through that tricky period. Okay. So what we can also do with those 5 measures is average them in total and look at a 1-number summary of the strength, essentially. And if we do that and look at the UK top 50 who score very well on that summary versus those that score poorly, we see a big difference. So that is why it's in the interest of brands to perform well and outperform competitors in all 5 of those areas and tick as many of those boxes as possible. The more of those boxes that are ticked, the higher the likelihood that the brand will actually grow in value. So one final question for you. So these are the scores for the same brand that we've termed the UK's healthiest brand. Not the most valuable, but the healthiest from an equity perspective. So communications, really, really strong score, but some very strong scores across the board. So any guesses as to which brand this is? Dulux. Okay, very good guess. Correct. So I think the sheepdog may play a role in communications. Clearly, brand equity is very important, but for brands to be a success on the global stage, there are a myriad other factors involved, and that's something we'll explore further with our panel discussion with Sir Martin a little later on. But just to give you a flavour of some of the UK brands that have very successfully scaled globally, we've taken our top 3 and looked at the proportion of their revenues that actually come from overseas. So Vodafone, HSBC and Shell the average overseas revenue proportion of the UK top 50 was 54%. Vodafone came in at almost 90%, HSBC almost 80%, Shell almost 2/3 of that brand's revenue coming from overseas. So certainly there are some UK brands that have very successfully scaled globally. And as I said, that's something else we'll explore shortly as to how they've done that and also how to do that generally. So just to wrap up, just to summarise the three key things that we've talked about today. So clearly, building equity is important to maximise the growth potential of your brand. Living on reputation and fame alone is not enough, and we've seen that the beginnings of that gap in the UK, so definitely something to think about in refocusing. We've talked about the 5 key areas to be able to do that as a kind of intuitive health check for your brand versus the competition. Outperforming the competition in as many of those areas as possible, as I said, will enable you to grow your value at the fastest rate. A question we're often asked, however, is which of those key elements is most important to actually drive brand value? So innovation is by far the most powerful. All of them add value and serve as value generators, but innovation is the most powerful of all. But innovation is a term that's thrown around quite a lot in the industry. So just to talk about what we mean with our BrandZ data when we talk about innovation, it's a composite measure of 3 sub-measures, if you like. So innovation is comprised of being seen to be a leader, being seen to be creative, and being seen to be disruptive. If you can do all of those things, you'll be perceived to be innovative. But that's a really important point. When we talk about being innovative, we're not saying just invest in R&D. And of course, that is important to maintain your edge, certainly in some categories more than others, but it's about perceived innovation. So your innovation needs to be perceived by the consumer. So by all means, be bold, be brave, be creative, but make sure that you shout about it, make sure your consumer knows about it, and that's where you'll really drive value from. And then finally, we talked about equity alone not being enough to succeed on the global stage. So again, it's something we'll revisit a bit later on, how to successfully scale successful equity globally.